Good evening, brethren. I think we're going to try something new. I know folks don't like new, but I'm thinking we'll try something new next week. Now, Johnny sang 2 songs and then 2 songs, so that's something new. So I thought what I would do next week is I'm going to preach from the back of the auditorium. And I am just going to see if I can, by doing that, if everybody will move forward. And so then, maybe those old churches that you see from years ago had the right idea. If you go into a lot of those really old buildings, and I guess maybe it was for acoustic purposes or something, I'm not real sure. But when you walk in, you don't see a pulpit. You see an altar and all this stuff. But the pulpit is actually in some stairs where the guy would go, and he'd stand in the middle of the congregation. And he could preach from the middle. And I thought, well, buddy, I'll tell you what, I'd like to see him get away from you then. But my luck, they'd all move the other side or something, But that's kind of interesting. Brethren, I don't know why we don't sit up closer. Everything is on a screen here. We're in the book of Daniel. If you'd like to be turning in your Bibles there. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 6, and this is probably going to be the last chapter that you're going to be extremely familiar with. We haven't done a whole lot of preaching in times past from chapters 7 through 12, and that's because there's a lot that goes into it. And there's some good lessons in there that you can just draw out a section of Scripture, but as far as just doing expository preaching from those chapters, we haven't done a lot of it in the past. And so we're going to try to, of course, look at every verse in the book of Daniel. We're in chapter 6, and we've talked about chapter 1. You have that great chapter about Daniel refusing the king's food and the great test that they go through where the young Jewish boys, their countenance and their physical appearance is just as good, even better, than than those boys who had ate the king's dainties, and so they were able to keep their, of course, the laws concerning food. Chapter 2, remember the great image, which we said in chapter 3 was probably the image that Nebuchadnezzar had built. The head of gold, and then the chest of silver, and then the midsection and thighs of brass, and then, of course, the legs of iron, representing the 4 kingdoms. And we will see those 4 kingdoms again in chapter 7, though, of course, totally different icons, totally different imagery there. We'll be looking at animals that represent those, and it's going to be fun. You really will. I love those chapters. Then in chapter 4, we looked at the training of a king, where Nebuchadnezzar is told and warned. God sends him a message. God gives him a dream. Daniel interprets that dream for him, and then Daniel warns him, says, look, king, this is going to take place. If you don't humble yourself, change your attitude toward the poor, and get sin out of your life, you're going to be cast out. You're going to roam around like an animal. Your hair is going to grow out. You're going to sleep. You're out in the field. You're going to eat grass. And lo and behold, 12 months later, I guess Nebuchadnezzar thought the warning was done, or he could do what he wanted to. And you remember, he was walking in his palace talking about how great he was and how great his kingdom was and how he had done it by his mighty hand. And God, before he could even get those words out, God says, you've been warned. And, of course, he spends a period of time running around as an animal. Then in chapter 5, we saw the writing on the wall, which is the training of another king. We're going to see, we could even, talk about this being a training of a king again tonight. Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson. He was able to benefit from that. He changed his attitude. He basically repented, if you will. And some believe that he went on to become a worshiper of the Most High God. He talks about God, but you can't help but just wonder if he didn't still have some of his pagan ideologies as well. Belshazzar, on the other hand, does not get a chance to repent. You remember, he is told tonight you're going to die, and your kingdom is going to be taken away from you and given to the Medes and the Persians. And in chapter 6, we meet our first Persian king, Darius the Mede, if you will. The Medes and the Persians, pretty much the same kingdom. They're from 2 different areas, but they pretty much work together, as we will see. Cyrus, it's believed, is the main king right now, and that he kind of lets Darius is running the province of Chaldea, if you will, or the Babylonian kingdom. We call this Daniel in the lion's den. It's where we meet Darius the first time. Daniel's faith, when we think of it, there was a period of time there in the Lambert VBS series where, you couldn't get away from, you had Jonah and you had Daniel every year. If there was going to be 2 characters in the Vacation Bible School that year, you better believe 2 of those was going to be Jonah, the great fish story. Kids love that one. And a story about Daniel, either the the fiery furnace of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, or even the lion's den. It's always been a thing, and children have looked at that. We even talk about that, that song, How Shall the Young Secure Their Heart? And we look at Daniel, and we look at Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego is how we mostly know those young boys, but that's their Israelite name, their Jewish name. We look at them and say, there's an exemplary character of how someone should be in their young age, and that's true. A great example and inspiration for many young people. Who can think of that boy somewhere probably between 15 and 17, surely between 15 and 20. We don't know for sure. We just don't have the exact days, but young men that age, even up to 20, were considered to be young men, young people. As a matter of fact, if you were going to be a priest for the Most High God, do you know how old you would begin when you started that? Not 20, not 21, not 22. You would be 30 years old before you would start. 30 years old. And you could do that service for 20 years, then you had to stop. But remember, they refused that. And that's been a great inspiration. Young people can overcome peer pressure. They can overcome authorities telling them to do something that they ought not. They can stand true to God. And we've looked at that, and that's a great thing. But Daniel should be an inspiration for older people as well. It is believed that Daniel is probably in his 80s. He's been in Babylon for a long time. It's not going to be too much longer before he's going to figure out from reading from the book of Jeremiah that it's time for Israel to go back home. Daniel, we're not told, but I don't believe he makes that trip. Looks like that would be mentioned, like he would be mentioned in part of the group that goes back, and he's not. Either he dies before they go back, or he's like a lot of folks who are pushing 90 years old. The trip would probably have killed him. He's been there a long time, and he's just as happy to stay there and finish out his days. He's been a great servant for the Chaldean kings, and here he'll be a great servant, of course, of the Persian kings as well. He's an old man now. An old man, remember Belshazzar was going to tell him about how he's going to promote him and make him great and give him part of his kingdom and things of this nature, and it just doesn't seem to have much of an impression with Daniel at this time. He's getting up there. He ought to be retired, but he finds himself being compelled back into public service by these very kings. The stage is set. Daniel is successful. Notice verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes. Now, basically what these guys would be like little governors or mayors. They ran the local principalities. And their responsibility was to get back with these other folks we're going to see here in just a minute. 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. Now, when we think of princes, we think about king's son. Kind of lose that idea for a minute. Princes were just somebody that's kind of in the royal family in some places, like in Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, I think there's over like 5,000 princes in Saudi Arabia, the royal family. But it's also just kind of like an emir, or somebody that's given the charge. So be careful how that word is used. Don't think that that's 120 sons of the king. That's not. Which should be over the whole kingdom. Verse 2, and over these 3 presidents, we might refer to them as governors. If you look it up in Strong's Concordance, you'll see that it refers to them as emirs. These were bigwigs now. Each one of these guys had, 40 different governors or whatever under them. And notice of whom Daniel was first. There's only 3 top dogs now besides the king, and Daniel is one of those men. It says that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. In other words, they're kind of like the accounting. They're like the local IRS agent, if you will. And you have these local guys who are taxing and running their administrations, and they're paying up, if you will, to these 3 who are making sure that everybody below them, those 40, are paying all the things that they should, and then they're sending it on to the king. And the king is noticing no discrepancies in Daniel's records. There's not any problem. There's not like Washington today. We're like, hey, look, we've lost $1 billion. Well, somebody find it. It's laying around somewhere. It's amazing how accounting and things done nowadays. I remember a few years back, they talked about giving the nurses at Erlanger a raise, and that greatly. I'm always interested in that. Since how my wife is a nurse there, I'm always interested. Said they had found $1.5 million that they didn't know they had. And I'm going to tell you something. If I had $1.5 million laying around my house somewhere, I would know where it is, But that's amazing how they can just lose stuff like that. Well, that's what these guys were, and Daniel was meticulous. Daniel was the kind of guy that was faithful to the job that was given him. There wasn't any shenanigans going on in his watch. Notice Daniel's successful. He's one of the president's 3, one of the 3 emirs, and he's above all the others. Notice, then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him. He was a good man. and he was going to do what was right. If you gave him a task, he was going to carry out that task. And it was not a task, it was not something where you were going to have to send somebody to make sure that he was doing his job. Now, brethren, that ought to tell us something. As Christians, we ought to be on a higher plane, if you will, than just your average employee. We shouldn't have to have somebody watching over us. We shouldn't have somebody to look over our shoulders to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to be doing. Because a Christian is going to be the best type of employee you can have, because he realizes, I'm serving Jesus Christ first and foremost. And this job, you may be my job, you may be my boss at work, but I serve a greater boss than you. And I want to make sure that what I'm doing is right, because I don't want to bring shame or reproach upon my Lord. The Lord did his job. Daniel, you're going to find that with Joseph, with Daniel, with so many people in the Bible that were Christians, that were, Jews, that were faithful to God in heaven. They were exemplary in their conduct. And what were they doing? What they were supposed to. They were doing the job that they were supposed to. And yet, that, as then is now, it was rare. It was rare that a man would do his job and not try to benefit from it in some way that was illegal to it. That's why we ought to have more Christian representatives and more Christians in law enforcement, in keeping the laws, in prosecution, things of this nature. If we did that, then maybe the system would be a whole lot better off. Shouldn't it be? Of course. Notice there was an excellent spirit in him. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. He has an excellent spirit. He's what he ought to be. And this is what gets him in trouble. The king is saying, you know what? This man is sharp as a tack. His books are always in order. His payments are always on time. I'm telling you what, his ship is in order. He knows exactly what's going on. And I think that I'm going to make him boss over everybody. Maybe he can straighten up these other two yahoos, might be the idea there. So he thinks to put him over the whole realm. And the bad thing about that, his success leads to envy. His character is even spoken of by his enemies. Notice the guys who are wanting his job, if you will. The presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. How would you like to be one of those 40 princes under Daniel, when you know good and well that there's 80 princes out there that aren't having to send all their money up the pipe? They get to keep a little on the side, because when they report it, that president or emir is keeping a little on the side, and he's got his own things going, and everybody's getting rich in these other two provinces, these administrators, if you will, and yet they're not, because what's Daniel doing? He's saying, you've collected this is what I expect. And they're like, well, maybe we can catch him with what's going up the chain then. He's probably keeping something back. He won't let us keep nothing. He won't let us get any kickbacks, because, maybe he's keeping it all. And that's not the case. Notice they seek occasion against him, but don't you know they weren't going through his records? Don't you know they were looking for every little jot, every little dot? They were looking for cross T's. They were trying to find something against him concerning the kingdom. But notice, they could find none occasion nor fault in what he was doing. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error found in him. Even his own enemies talked about how great a man he was. There was only one way that they were going to be able to get to him. And you see, he worshiped a different God than all the other Chaldeans, all the other Babylonians. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel. Wouldn't that be great if people could say that about me and you? And hopefully, brethren, that's exactly what they can say about me and you. He's a good man. She's a good woman. You can trust her. If she tells you she'll do something, she'll do it. If he tells you he'll do something, he'll do it. You give him a task, he's going to accomplish it, because he is a child of God first and foremost. It matters to him how the God of heaven views him. It matters to him how people view him. And so he's what he ought to be. That's exactly what these folks are saying. We're not going to get any dirt on Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. And so Daniel is targeted, and the wheels go into motion. The king is approached by Daniel's enemies. And these guys, they can't be up front. That's the difference between Christians and people in the world. Christians are up front. This is what we're about. This is what we do. Where people in the world are manipulative. They'll do the very things that they want to see get done. And they'll twist things, and they'll turn things so that it looks better for them and worse for you. And a lot of times they'll do it even if it means lying to you, or lying to somebody else, or just totally fabricating something, or gossiping about you, and speaking about things that are untrue. You got to be careful with that. Notice this. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king. Now, here's all of his loyal subjects, Here's all the bigwigs, if you will, in his kingdom, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. Well, that first and foremost got to get you in a pretty good mood right there. Hey, these guys love me. He's approached. He thinks they're doing this out of respect for him. Like most men, and I'm afraid myself, yourself as well, he is blinded by their manipulation. Why? Because he trusts them. And because they're saying good things about him, and his pride lifts him up. He's not thinking clearly. You know, he's been in kingdoms before. What happens to kings? They're usually assassinated. They're killed by somebody who's wanting their position. He should have saw it coming, but he thinks these men are reverencing him. He thinks these men really care about him, when in reality, the only thing they care about is themselves. And they want to tear Daniel down. You know why? Because he's doing it. He's doing exactly what he ought to do. He is an exemplary leader in Chaldea. As far as the Babylonians go, there's none greater than Daniel. He is a man to be respected. You can trust him. The king looks to him. The king's even wanting to promote him. Why? Because he's what he ought to be. And people can't stand that because they're not what they ought to be. And they says, if we can't be what we ought to be, then you're not going to be what you ought to be, and we're going to tear you down. We're going to attack you. And so, brethren, when you're living your life and you're doing what God would have you to do, don't be surprised when people poke fun at you and try to tear you down because they're saying, I can't live that life and neither can you. They're already telling you something about yourself. Do you remember David when he went to the battlefield and says, this uncircumcised Philistine, when's somebody going to do something about it? You remember what his oldest brother said? His oldest brother started attacking Daniel. Said, who are you to come out here and criticize us? Who's keeping those few sheep? You remember he started putting him down. In other words, we're scared to death to go out there and face that giant. Don't you even think about it. We can't do it. You certainly can't do it. So, brethren, don't let folks stand in your way. Let us not grow weary in well-doing because people put us down for trying to do what's right. You keep driving on. Due season will reap. Don't let folks, because of their fear and their inability to go on, keep you from going on. They're trying to manipulate him, and he can't see it coming. All the presidents, the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute, King. We all got together for you. And to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save thee, O king, he shall be cast in the den of lions. King, we love you. We think you're the greatest thing since cotton candy. And we want to exalt you and lift you up for the next month. We want to make it where nobody can pray or say anything that's not in your name. Not pray to their gods, but pray to you. And the king's like, well, man, that sounds pretty good. Now, O king, establish a decree and sign the writing. You see, Babylon, Chaldea, one of the first things, you had the Code of Hammurabi, but that was rare. It was rare for people to have a Declaration of Independence, if you will, or a Bill of Rights, or a Constitution, or a Magna Carta, these kind of things. The Code of Hammurabi, you had written law. Usually the king just said what he wanted to whatever hit him when you brought in your case in front of him. But now the Chaldeans have a written law, and they're so serious about this written law that once it was written, it could not be broken. Once the pen hit the paper and it was signed, it was law. And that's all they got to do. Get him to sign that decree. Well, that it could not be changed. Notice, they're setting him up. According to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Couldn't be done. Verse 9, wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. He says, boy, these guys really like me. Things are going good. I appreciate what they're trying to honor me. So, hey, I'm going to sign it into law. Well, the trap is sprung. And Daniel, he is not a man to disappoint when it comes to doing what's right. Because Daniel's going to keep doing what he's been doing. He continues to pray to the God of all heaven and all earth. Regardless of what men have said, Daniel is going to obey God. Notice verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled down upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. He didn't let anything change. He would open the doors. Wouldn't it have been so easy for him to just kept those windows closed? But he didn't. He didn't change anything that he'd been doing. Now, some people might look at that and say, well, that's kind of, Daniel's being awful cocky there. He's not being cocky. He's not a man of rebellious spirit, as we're going to see here in just a minute. He was simply doing what he had been doing from a young man. From a young man, he had been doing this, and now he's in his 80s. For 60-plus years, he's been praying the same way. And he's not going to let a king and all of his arrogance step over into an area where the king has no right and tell him that he can't do that anymore. He is going to continue to do that. And notice the Jews prayed 3 times a day, as we're going to see here in Psalms. It was just something they had done even from the earliest of times. They had prayed 3 times a day. It's kind of interesting. How many of you are familiar with how many times the Muslims pray? Can you hold it up for me? Let me see it. How many times a day do they pray? That's right. They pray 5 times a day. You know how that came about? First of all, the Jews prayed 3 times a day. And a fellow by the name of Muhammad saw that and said, that's pretty cool. But he came up with a story where they were supposed to pray like 1,000 times a day. I can't remember the number, but it was something you would have to spend literally every moment of the day praying. And so he bartered with God and said, well, God, that's a lot of time. What about we just pray 750 times? And God said, okay, it's good, 750 times. Then, Muhammad looked at it and said, boy, it's still a lot. What about we just pray, say, 100 times? And God says, 100 times will be fine. And he says, well, that's still a lot. What about 50 times? And God said, well, 50 times will be good. And he says, well, that's still a lot. We probably couldn't get a lot done. What about 10 times? And, of course, God said, that'd be good, 10 times. And then the last time Muhammad said, God, if you don't mind, how about we just pray 5 times a day? Would that be good enough? And God says, yes, pray 5 times a day. This is according to Muhammad. Doesn't that story sound familiar? Have you heard that before? Who did the very same thing that Muhammad was familiar with, having read that? Yeah, Abraham and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. Where do you think he got the story? Well, anyway, Daniel's not a man of rebellious spirit, but notice in Psalms 55:17, a psalm of David, says, evening and morning and at noon will I pray, and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. Now remember, Daniel is not a man who grew up his entire life in Jerusalem. Sometimes between the age of 12 and 20, somewhere in there, he was carried away. And so what did he have to go by? What did those Jews in in Babylon have to go by? They had their Bibles. They had copies of the Scripture. And they could read that. So as a young man, he made a habit to pray at evening, at morning, and at noon. And he would pray towards Jerusalem. You might say, why in the world did they do that? Why would they? You notice the Muslims today pray towards, is it Mecca, I think? Well, why would they do that? Remember 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon is dedicating the temple of God. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27, Solomon says, this is part of his prayer. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded? Yet have thou respect unto the prayers of thy servant, and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to hearken unto the cry and to the prayer which thy servant prayeth before thee today, that thine eyes may be open this night and day, even toward the place of which thou hast said, my name shall be there, that thou mayest hearken unto the prayer which thy servant shall make toward this place. And he'll go on. And hearken thou to the supplication of thy servant and of thy people Israel, when they shall pray toward this place. And hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and when thou hearest, forgive. He says, let people pray towards this place. When they do that, listen to them. This is Solomon's prayer to God that's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 8. Now notice down here at the bottom, this is from the New King James Version. It says, and was his custom since early days. Daniel just didn't come up with this. This was not something he was being rebellious, being flagrant, and just saying, in your face, king. This is something that he had done since he was a young man. And he was going to continue to pray towards Jerusalem, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 8. He was going to pray 3 times a day, as recorded in Psalms 55, because he could read the Scriptures. He knew that that's what had been done in the past. This had been done by the ancients, and he was going to continue to do this. Even his position, his prayer position, is something that he just didn't say, hey, I'm going to do this, and I want to do something where everybody will look at me. No. In that very same chapter we were just reading, at the end of that prayer, notice, and it was so that when Solomon had made an end of praying, all this prayer and supplication unto the Lord, he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread up to heaven. You see, he had been on his knees, and he had his hands raised, and he was looking to heaven as he prayed in front of the altar of God in the temple. Now, does that mean that you and I have to do that? No. Is it wrong to do that? No. As a matter of fact, I can't remember where it was, but I was at some place that every time they prayed, the preacher would stand beside the pulpit, and he would get on his knees. I don't remember where that was. But is there anything wrong with that? Certainly not. But do you know, we find in the Bible where people actually laid completely down on their face, on their belly, completely down on their bodies, face down on the dirt, and would pray to God. Anything wrong with that? No. Anything wrong with putting your hands like this and closing your eyes, bowing your head? No. No, there's nothing wrong with that. How you choose to pray, whether you pray with your eyes open, your eyes closed, your head bowed, your head raised. That's a personal preference. The idea of worship in the Bible is proseuche. The Greek word means to kiss towards. That's what we know. This is what Solomon's position was. Daniel wanted to do that. He didn't have anything else to go by. He hadn't been in Jerusalem in years. But he had the scriptures. He could see how Solomon prayed. He wanted to pray that way. He could see that Solomon said, pray towards this place. He wanted to be a part of that. He wanted to pray 3 times a day, and he did that. Notice these men assembled now, his enemies, and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. They came near and spake before the king, says, aha, we got him now. Hast thou not signed the decree? Of course he knew he had. That every man shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. He's in your face, king. He's not doing what you said. He's doing this not 1 time. He's doing it 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. Why? Because the man ain't stupid. He put it together, and he knew exactly what these guys had been. It hadn't been to honor him. It hadn't been because of their great love for him. It had been because of their hatred and their envy of Daniel. And what's so bad about it was he played right into it. And it's going to eat at his soul for the next 24 hours. He was displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. Don't you know he's like the president? He went there and hopped on the phone even though they didn't have one. But he was trying to do everything he could, work in the back doors and everything to try to get around this decree he had written. But there's nobody to go to. There's nobody to get a vote from. He had signed the decree. He did everything he could think of in his power to make this stop. But he was powerless. He had signed it. He labored to the going down of the sun to deliver him. But these men, they're not going to have that. No, they know the law. These men assembled unto the king, said unto the king, now, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, that no decree nor statute with the king established may be changed. Here they are quoting the law to the king. Don't you know they just had to seethe him? Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him in the lions. And he didn't want to do this. He's losing his best man. Losing his best man. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And don't you know Darius wasn't a worshiper of the true God? In fact, he had allowed men to worship him for 30 days. But now he's saying, I hope there's something to this. I really hope that Daniel's God can deliver him. A stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, his ring. Puts it in that wax and makes that sealed, and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. We might say Daniel's fate is sealed. Did you know that's where that came from, that expression? When they would give you a court order or something for execution, it would have to have that seal on it. His fate is sealed. Not really, is it? Darius is worried. He's concerned about Daniel. Daniel's his number 1 man. Then the king goes to his palace. He passed the night fasting, wouldn't eat. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and the sleep went from him. He stays up all night. You can just see him pacing through the palace, hoping some way that this God that Daniel worships really will deliver him. Darius is worried. His concern for Daniel is evident. Notice the king arose very early in the morning, not that he could sleep, went in haste into the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice. You can hear his voice breaking. The king now, the most powerful man, his voice breaking, says, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. Don't you know? You know the look on his face. You're still alive? Really? It worked? Your God saved you? O king, live. My God has sent his angels and has shut the mouth, angel, and has shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. I didn't break a law, king, that should have been brought. You shouldn't have signed that. Basically is the idea here. I have done nothing against you. I have done everything for you, Daniel could say. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Oh, brethren, do we have that kind of faith? Isn't that humbling? Because he believed in his God. Well, one thing's for sure, the politics in Babylon's over with for that day. Oh, yeah, it's not a good thing to mess with the king. It's not a good thing to try to manipulate the king. And just like with Mordecai, as we were looking this morning in our adult class, just like with Mordecai, the tables have turned. In the book of Esther, Haman builds a gallows to slay Mordecai on, and within 24 hours finds himself hanging on that very gallows. Here, the men who had come up with this great plan to destroy Daniel are going to be destroyed by the very plan that they had concocted to destroy him in the very manner. David talks about this very thing. In Psalms chapter 7, verse 14 says, Behold, he travaileth with iniquity. In other words, this man is pregnant with iniquity, and hath conceived mischief and brought forth falsehood. This is just an evil person David is talking about. He made a pit and digged it, and is fallen into the ditch which he made. In other words, he was trying to set somebody up, set someone up, and he fell into it himself. Verse 16, his mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate. The pate is the top of your head, the crown of your head. He made it for somebody else, but the wicked man found himself in the very trap that he had conceived. That's one of the oldest Psalms. David talking about how you better be careful when you're trying to get somebody else. You may find yourself being gotten. Verse 24, the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast him in the den of lions. But not only them, notice, their children, their wives, the lions, and says, and the lions had the mastery of them, and break all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. If you go to Freed-Hardeman University, they have a stuffed lion in the athletic part over there in the gym. They're the Lions, by the way. That's the school mascot. And I just happened to be killing some time over there this past year and went in to see that lion, and just really didn't know it was there. Just went in, was looking around and saw it. And the paw on that puppy, and it's not a puppy, I know it's a lion, but you would not believe the size of the hand, the paw of that thing. And you would imagine this lion being upset with you, you wouldn't do very well. Now imagine a whole mess of them, and they're hungry. They're hungry. They haven't been fed. They weren't allowed to eat Daniel, so they're ready. And that's exactly what these people find themselves dealing with. It would not have been pretty. Then King Darius wrote unto all peoples and nations. Now this is the king's proclamation that's going to go out through the entire Chaldean kingdom. And languages that dwelt in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. Would to God that we could convince our nation of this very thing that was learned so difficult, with such difficulty by three of the Chaldean kings. Nebuchadnezzar in his time being a wild animal, roaming around sleeping in the dirt, if you will. Belteshazzar, who lost his life and his kingdom overnight. And here Darius, caught up in this great plot. All learn that what men today should know, have grown up in a nation that taught them, have grown up with people that have believed in the God of heaven, yet today choose to reject him and do whatsoever they will. Notice the king goes on and says, and delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and earth. Who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? Now this went out as a decree from the king. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You see, as Cyrus continues to make his domain bigger and takes over control of everything, Daniel's even going to serve him. I guess you don't have a retirement plan with the Chaldeans or with the Medes and the Persians. Think about the character and the qualities we see in this aged saint. Excellent spirit, verse 3, without fault in his business dealings. What about my spirit? What about your spirit? Is it an excellent spirit? Are we faultless in our business dealings? Faithful to those that are over him? He was committed to prayer. Brethren, no, you just can't emphasize enough the power of prayer and our need for it. He obeyed God rather than man. And last but not least, he believed in God. Let me ask you something this evening. Do you believe in God? Most of us, I believe, everybody here was, oh, yes, I believe in God. Well, if you believe in God, have you obeyed him? Have you obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ? The good news. What is that good news? That God sent his son, Jesus, left heaven and came and lived on this earth and died a sinless death, died a sinless man, murdered, put to death on the cross for our salvation. Do you believe that? Are you willing to confess before men that indeed Jesus is the Christ, repenting, turning away from your sins, and being baptized in water, put under the water and raised to walk in newness of life? God will clean you up. You have the confidence in him. Faith in the operation of God is how it's stated in Colossians 2 at verse 12. You meet the blood of Jesus in the watery grave of baptism. You're raised to walk in newness of life. Have you done that? If you haven't, you need to come forward. You need to obey the gospel. You say, I'm not sure exactly what to do. I've heard what you said, preacher, but I'm not convinced. I'm not sure. Then let's study together. Do you believe in God? And brethren, let me ask you something. Do you believe in God? You say, well, yeah, Ron, I'm a Christian. I'm here. Does it show in your life? Is God first and foremost in your life? Do people around you know how much God means to you? If not, change it. Let them know. Make him a part of your life. Let's be bubbling over with our love for God and our love for fellow men and our love of Jesus Christ. Let it be shown in our lives. Brethren, if we can help in any way, we encourage you to come as together we stand and sing.